welcome to today's discussion about appreciation and the education workforce. I'm your host for today, Sinéad Brearty, Chief Executive at Education Support. And I'm just going to introduce the charity and then introduce you to our fantastic panel for the chat today. Education Support has been around for 144 years. We are a charity and our mission is to improve the mental health and well-being of everyone in the education workforce. So a fairly tall order, you might say. We do this because we believe that better well-being and mental health leads to better teaching and learning. We were set up by teachers for teachers, and that's through and through in the ethos of the work that we do. And through all of those years of working alongside the profession, we've learned that the well-being of each member of the education workforce really exists at the intersection of that person, the institution they work for, and the wider education system within which we all operate. So it's a point where there's an overlap between our personal choices, the culture and the leadership of our workplaces, and the policy environment that's set by the government of the day. And what better way to get into a conversation that's going to touch on all those different areas of the education system than to have the fantastic people we have for today's conversation, bringing different perspectives from across that system. So I'm going to ask colleagues to introduce themselves and then we'll get stuck in. So Kat, can I ask you to begin, please?
Thank you, Sinead. I'm Katy Howard. I'm Assistant Principal at a North Roos School in Northamptonshire. I'm author of the book Stop Talking About Wellbeing, a pragmatic approach to teacher workload, and I'm additionally ambassador for a charity called the MTPT Project, which supports teachers on maternity leave and paternity leave to really feel empowered during their time out of the building and when they return to work.
You certainly can. Hi, my name is Ben Amponsa. I'm a psychotherapist and coach consultant in private practice, and I also work as a clinical consultant for education support. At the moment, I myself am actually studying. I'm doing a doctorate in counselling psychology just to finalise my studying, as it were, and very much enjoying taking my experience to a new level, yeah, it's really good to be here, and hopefully I can contribute some interesting perspectives.
Yeah, hi everyone. So my name is Kane McKinnon. I am the Director of Programmes at Education Support. So I'm responsible for making sure that we deliver high quality, brilliant services and programmes to the education workforce to support and improve the mental health and wellbeing of everybody working in education. I've spent 6 years working in the area of workplace mental health. So hoping today that I can bring a perspective of what we can learn through the work that's been happening over the past 5 to 10 years in this space.
Well, let's get into the meat of today's discussion. We're here to look at the topic of appreciation, and this is something that I think is easy to overlook in the education sector. We did some research after the first lockdown and spoke to teachers, to support staff, and to school leaders about their experience. And what was so striking to us in that was the positivity that came back from school staff about the sense of appreciation they experienced, both from their colleagues and from the senior management teams in the environments that they were working in. And I think I've characterized it since as, colleagues energizing each other, recognizing the demands and the effort to meet those demands. And indeed, as a school governor, it's very visible to me across school staffs that people have been hugely supportive to each other. Now, the appreciation story isn't all positive. There's pretty good set levels of appreciation from parents, but it falls away in terms of how people experience maybe the general public, certainly the government, and most definitely the media. And we're all too familiar with more than one headline from the past 12 months that will have resonated with the kind of, what? How did anyone get to that? So appreciation. Ben, I'm going to start with you. It's a bit soft and fluffy, isn't it? This whole appreciation thing. I mean, who appreciates me, Ben? Why does it matter? Why is it so important to individuals?
Yeah, it is. It's one of those sorts of what exactly do we mean by appreciation sort of questions. But the reality of it is that appreciation is absolutely vital to people's sense of mental health. So what does appreciation really mean in the context of mental health? And the thing that I was immediately kind of drawn to is it's kind of directly linked to our sense of value. Okay, that's one thing. Value is one thing, and gratitude is another. And there have been loads of there has been a lot of research on those two things. But I then thought to myself, I'm just going to see what some of the research tells us about appreciation. I found a very interesting, I mean, there have been quite a number of studies, but I found a very interesting Swedish study, which interestingly enough was on kids. It was on school children between 10 and 14. And it was all about the power of appreciation. And what they found was that appreciation was a fuel, as to quote, for health and well-being, around 4 sub-themes: a feeling of sense of belonging, being cared for by others, being respected and listened to, and feeling valued and confirmed. And the fact of the matter is that what that tells us is that you learn from a very early age, from a very early age, it is a real factor that appreciation is feeds into our mental health. It helps us with that sense of feeling valued and all the rest of it. And it's vitally important that we feel that way. So I thought that was a really, really interesting study. But then there's the other stuff which shows that appreciation should be a two-way thing. We can feel appreciated, but if we practice a sort of appreciation attitude, or gratitude attitude it's sometimes called, then that actually can really, really help as well with our sense of well-being.
And in terms of the workplace then, how do you think appreciation plays out in the workplace? What effect does it have?
Well, I think one thing I'll say here is, from my experience as a therapist, because I have had a lot of teachers, as clients, what I have found is that, teachers need to feel that they are being appreciated. And that is kind of both by management and, shall we say, from a wider perspective. And I was very interested to see the study that you guys did, which showed that actually the appreciation from the general public is maybe not where it should be. And I think that's a really big factor. One of the things actually I didn't say earlier was, my husband is an ex-teacher, and he comes from a family of teachers, and obviously he has a lot of friends who are teachers. So I've kind of been quite steeped in the profession, shall we say. And it is really, it just makes such a difference, to feel that sense of appreciation for teachers, in the workplace. So I think it's absolutely vital, and it's one of the things that really, can act as an anchor, or can act as a real sort of boost for them. That's my sense of it.
And maybe this comes back to what you were just talking about in terms of the two-way dynamic around appreciation. But what can individuals themselves, what practically can they do if they want to begin to create that sense of appreciation, maybe a culture of appreciation even in their workplaces?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, one of the things, so from an individual perspective, we talk about things like, practice appreciation, look at the things, because one of the things that happens when we start to feel undervalued and such is you start to get into some quite negative thinking, and you start to discount the positive stuff that's happening. And so what I would always say is, one of the things that these gratitude experiments, which were pioneered by a very famous psychologist called Seligman, are saying is, if you look for the positive things that are going on in your life, even on a daily basis, that can actually make a huge difference. So one of the things that I sometimes say to clients, teachers, I've said this to, maybe the thing to do there is just to consider, if a pupil has said, you really helped me with this or whatever, try and keep an eye on those things, and that can act as a real offset to you begin to think, actually, it's all doom and gloom, no one appreciates me, and you getting into a negative spiral like that.
Kat, just turning to you and thinking about teachers specifically, what do you think is so important about appreciation for teachers?
Yeah, I think it really builds on what Ben was saying around this sense of belonging. We tend to find generally that teachers remain in the profession, particularly in schools, longer when they feel that sense of community and they feel that sense of belonging within the workplace where they work. I think where maybe we miss a trick on that is that we don't necessarily know how to do that well, or know how to demonstrate appreciation as a profession. We're not necessarily trained or have those systems in place that make people feel appreciated either explicitly or slightly more intrinsically. So if we think kind of intrinsic appreciation, things like development of policies to make sure that individuals feel really well supported, things like, policies that are going to come to the forefront and have come to the forefront over the last 12 months, unfortunately, like bereavement policies, compassionate leave, leading with those policies as a framework for a conversation rather than a directive, I think is really important. But in a slightly more kind of explicit way of making sure that we appreciate other people, I think sometimes we can be quite tokenistic in schools and turn it into, we have a conversation around, standing up in a Monday morning meeting and somebody gets a bottle of wine to take away. It's definitely what you don't want to say on a Monday morning. But we need to dig a little bit deeper than that if we're going to make people feel valued, and we're going to empower people ultimately to feel a sense of autonomy, because I think that sense of trust and autonomy leads to people feeling appreciated. If we're appreciating the work, it moves away from being tokenistic, and it has a sense of authenticity to it. So I think the closer that we can take our levels of appreciation to a teacher's core purpose, I think the more meaningful and the more genuine that appreciation becomes. And I think we build really powerful relationships at kind of a local level when we do that.
Sometimes when I'm talking to people who are working in schools, I observe a kind of repeated pattern of people having an attitude of almost being sacrificial of themselves to the job. And this overlaps maybe a bit with the idea of vocation. And certainly we know there's lots of literature about how people in the caring professions are often less good at taking care of themselves. Do you think that sacrificial thing is somehow relevant to maybe the lack of appreciation that we experience?
I think that we focus perhaps on the wrong things. And if we start appreciating hard work and endless amounts of hours, when we all have a finite amount of time in schools, which really needs to be acknowledged, teachers have the same, in an ideal world, working hours as every other person. And so if we start rewarding or demonstrating appreciation for those people that go above and beyond and going the extra mile and doing it for the children, and all of those narratives that we've heard before, then we're not necessarily paying as much attention to the people that are, sharing good practice, which means that, for example, centralized planning, which means that every individual can share best practice and still go home at night and spend time with their children instead of, laboriously putting lessons together until the middle of the night. And where are we doing that and rewarding and appreciating those individuals? Because actually it's that ripple effect, isn't it, of that work is really incredible work that will then benefit many other people. If we start paying more attention to that as senior leaders, then maybe we're appreciating the right kind of practice, the right kind of approach that we want to see in schools.
You're talking about centralized planning there, which is a great example of something really specific that people can do in the workplaces. Are there other examples around workload or culture that you've seen and have been particularly impressed at the impact that they make on the environment? And I suppose to your point earlier about implicit appreciation really kind of demonstrate that.
I think coaching or any kind of training around how to have conversations in schools is really beneficial to building that sense of appreciation, because I think the structure of an appreciative conversation is, very much one and the same, whether you're having a conversation with a stakeholder like a parent or carer, what that conversation can look like that means that you go away feeling positive and empowered and motivated and like there was an action plan agreed between you, that looking collaboratively at the problem rather than talking to the person as though they're the problem, I think is absolutely vital to us having better conversations in schools. If we have explicit training with teachers in how to have those conversations, I think that would do really powerful things for things like relational trust, professional relationships particularly between kind of leaders or middle leaders and teachers and newer teachers to the profession that maybe don't have that experience of building professional relationships?
It's always really interesting to me when I see people, professionals who are simply superb at engaging with kids, and the development and giving feedback and knowing how to communicate really effectively and get their message across to children and young people, and who don't have the same skill in their interpersonal relationships with colleagues. And of course, your point is absolutely right. They're never trained for this. They're never given the support to do it. So a hugely valuable point, I think, there in that. Faye, just thinking about this, you know, the significance of appreciation, and we've talked about how important it is for individuals' well-being, and how easy it is to be tokenistic, and that actually is probably counterproductive if I'm understanding the point Kat's making there. But what can schools actually do to make sure that that it's prioritized, that it's understood and prioritized as something useful and good and important?
Building on a lot of the points that Ben and Kat have made, I think the first thing that I would say is that I believe there's no better way to show appreciation of your staff than prioritising their mental health and well-being, putting that at the heart of decision making, and actually creating the environments and the cultures where they feel psychologically safe. And that is more than just saying thank you. But I know that in a round sounds quite fluffy in itself. So I think if I was to outline kind of 5 steps that I think schools could take to really show appreciation and link to mental health and well-being, I think for me, the first thing is to listen. To actually feel listened to is to feel appreciated. I know personally that I would much rather feel listened to than just hear thank you all of the time. So for schools, for them to listen, to understand what the needs are in relation to staff mental health and well-being. And I'm not just talking about that annual survey that gives us a moment in time, but actually regularly doing pulse checks, checking in, hearing what your staff have to say, doing a deeper dive into some of the issues, and understanding what some of the drivers are for your staff not feeling at their best or not feeling appreciated. It's important to say that you might not be able to solve all of those drivers, but you at least have to listen and understand them. So that would be my first step. My second step is you then need to respond. So what are you hearing? What are your staff telling you? And respond, put together a plan. What is your plan of action in terms of supporting staff mental health and well-being? And knowing that you're doing something about it is a way of showing that you appreciate what your staff have told you and actually that you need to take action. And for me, I think the third step that I would probably talk about is what Kat was talking on around promoting that open culture, creating a space where teachers can have conversations where they feel like their voice is valued, because actually feeling like your voice is valued is really important when you're looking at appreciation. So creating that open culture where people can talk about the challenges, the issues, how they're feeling is really important. I think the fourth step really is investing in your leadership and your line managers. I think, you know, we put a lot of pressure on those roles to kind of really understand how to have conversations about mental health and well-being. But often those roles are not given the knowledge and the skills and the experience to be able to do that in a way that actually resonates. And I think that goes back to the two-way conversation. You know, you can only really show appreciation if you feel like you have the skills and knowledge to have those conversations properly. And we know that, you know, line management relationship is a massive driver of satisfaction in the workplace, which is then linked to life satisfaction. So it's really important that that investment takes place. And then the fifth step for me is making sure that actually you can support people when they're not feeling at their best or when they're not at their best. I think one way of showing appreciation is actually how you treat people when they're maybe not performing at their best or feeling at their best or being at their best. That for me is the moment when people really need to feel appreciated. So making sure that you have the right support mechanisms in place, you have signposting to support, all of that stuff is really vital. So yeah, they're just some steps that I think schools can take to show appreciation linked to mental health and well-being, which is beyond the tokenistic stuff.
And for colleagues who are listening, who are thinking in their own head, you know, in my school, we just don't do appreciation. That's not the kind of environment I work in. What can they do to kind of constructively engage in trying to maybe improve? Because that's not about themselves necessarily. They you know, it's kind of beyond them and their own remit. What can they bring, or how can they approach the leadership team? How can they start a conversation internally about the culture and the role that it might play. Have any of you on the panel, have you been in situations where you've seen people having those kinds of conversations or trying to make some change in that way?
I think it comes back to what Faye was saying around making sure that there's opportunities for staff voice. I think is a really good start point, and making sure that that's almost a layered approach as well. So things like having working parties for any particular changes that go on, particularly at the moment, changes around processes or initiative. We know that a catch-up plan is going to be carried out, quite a monumental operational piece of work in schools, and where are we ensuring that we're having conversations with every layer of the staff body, from the NQT that's essentially never really taught perhaps for a great deal of time in a classroom, all the way through to senior leadership about how that will impact different people and providing opportunities. So I think staff voice needs to be prevalent through everything that we do at the moment, and making sure that we have those opportunities for conversations, like they said, not just a survey put out to people where you won't necessarily get the information, that really rich qualitative data that you get from a discussion and a feedback group. And I think it's then following through on that of a you said we did almost, of making sure that the results of that are demonstrated in what we're doing later on. I do also think that particularly around to what extent managers are equipped, of making sure that we are strengthening our leaders' knowledge of HR services. I work with a great deal of middle leaders and senior leaders that have never necessarily had, and I will hold my hand up that if it wasn't for my experience coming to teaching with a background in finance, that I wouldn't have necessarily had the understanding of what human resources can do, or how they present themselves in schools, and how that is a support mechanism. And I that's been raised before around the fact that HR is seen as this entity that's almost working on the side of the workplace as opposed to the side of the employee. Which I find really interesting, because it just wasn't like that. I also think that HR themselves in schools need massive amounts of support at the moment. They're going to be really quite stretched. When you look at other organisations and other sectors in comparison, they're operating human resources, departments. You look at a school, it's one or two people managing that massive body of staff. So I think that we really need to make sure that our operational side of running a school has got its house in order to be in a position to support staff overall.
The other thing that I've had conversations with people about is if they are in environments where, for whatever reason, leadership isn't able or willing to engage really in this agenda, the fact that Ofsted has turned its attention to some extent to well-being can be a helpful point of leverage. And I think, staff can also take the route of volunteering and being very helpful to senior leadership, because, to be honest, if somebody comes to you and says, I'd like to do something about this, given that Ofsted have the focus they have in it, you may not have any interest in it per se, but it's kind of hard to say, no, actually don't. Ben, do you want to add something there?
One of the things that I often talk to clients about from an individual basis when they're struggling with culture or environment, or, that's been the case for a number of my teaching clients, is, there is something very important about how you preserve your own psychological autonomy. And what often happens is people feel they can't speak up, and then they are diminished for that reason. So I try to encourage clients to, at least you will, on an individual basis, feel better if you speak up. One of the things, and I kind of can speak from a bit of experience, because my husband ended up leaving the profession because he was struggling with his own mental health issues, but he felt very unsupported. And he was a newly qualified teacher. He ended up leaving the profession entirely for that reason. It was such a shame, really, because he genuinely loved teaching. And so, there is something about, if you please try and speak up, because at least it'll help you to preserve something of that psychological integrity. But as you say there, Sinead, maybe the zeitgeist is now as well, because there is this focus on mental health. If you do speak up, maybe it won't just kind of be whipped under the carpet and such like, which of course is what a lot of people fear.
And I think certainly for, the number of I saw a little flicker across Kat's face when you talked about your husband having left as an NQT. I mean, we see so many fine teachers, fine prospective teachers leaving far too early. and it is an area that we need to really get to grips with. So I think really important points to be made there. I'm curious as well about the extent, so I talked at the start of this conversation about some of the research that we had done, and the great news being about how strong and well supported people felt by their colleagues and their school leaders, but they really don't feel appreciated at all by government actors. And here, I mean, by and large, we're talking sort of about the DFE and the policies that come out. And I'm very well aware that the officials sitting in the Department for Education are not sitting there thinking, how can I make the workforce feel unappreciated, or how could we demonstrate? And indeed the politicians, there's not an agenda to try and create that sense, and yet there is this very big disconnect between the profession and the Department for Education. Do you think it matters in terms of that as a factor in terms of the appreciation and how people experience it? Do you think it matters, that gap, that relationship strain, that lack of appreciation coming from the politicians and from the DFE? Do you think it is affecting individuals? I think certainly one of the things that we see around appreciation from government is not that it impacts people on a day-to-day basis. And that point about how the overlap between the system, the workplace, and the individual, the thing that's most local to all of us is ourselves. And so actually our own personal choices or the factors that are affecting us personally are the most front and center for us. And then the workplace, where we go day to day, if we're in a good workplace and we're not in great shape, we might be supported by that workplace. If we're in a good workplace and we are personally in good shape, we're probably thriving. The system, if you like, the policy environment doesn't have that direct impact. But over time, I think what we see is it compounding some difficulty. So that may be evidenced by features like how the accountability system works. So people not, recognizing there does need to be accountability, but actually, does it need to be an accountability system that leaves people feeling personally not valued, feeling under, the number of head teachers I talk to about the sleeplessness that goes with waiting for the call and then getting the call. That's just not very healthy, and I think is very clearly linked to the policy environment. So I think part of how we started to think about it is that you've got the very immediate connection to what's local to you, your own choices, your own workplace, and there is an impact from the wider system, but it's maybe slower or it happens over a longer period of time. I don't know if any of you want to comment on that at all.
So for me, I think there could potentially be an impact on some roles more than others. So if you think of the role of school leaders and head teachers, I wonder how much of their role is that kind of buffering. So if they're spending a huge amount of their time and their energy trying to create the environment, the culture, and also having to act as that buffer between government and actually their team, that's a lot that sits on their shoulders and on their plate. So it would be interesting to kind of look at what the impact is on particular roles, and you can create that local environment, and that can be an absolutely brilliant environment that you're creating. But actually, if your school leader or your head teacher is so consumed with acting as that buffer, then actually I think that's a risk and an issue that needs to be looked at.
I think emotional labour and the emotional burden that that all teachers and senior leaders carry has never been more prevalent, and I think that's a real issue, that buffer that you talk about, Faye. And I think that I think at a local level, and coming back to this idea of controllable factors and what is within our control is working out obviously how we start to change that perception. And I think when we talk about it at a national level, it feels like a really vast, uncontrollable, unmanageable feat. But if we take it back to what is within our control at a local level, of working with key stakeholders like parents, carers, local external agencies, local businesses, working out where we can build community links, I think what you then do at a micro level, and again it's that ripple effect, is actually start to shift the perception. And I think a real testament of that was recently in the media around just signposting you know, if things were or weren't going your way at a local level for your child's school, you're more than welcome to provide feedback for that. And the ratio of the praise that came through to local schools in light of remote learning and what those schools locally were doing for the children and the communities that they serve, we want to be making, you know, we really want to be shining a spotlight on events like that and things like that, and sharing that with staff as much as possible, you know, with individual teachers where you're getting that feedback, because that ripple effect, I think, is actually, you know, our biggest weapon as to maybe shifting that perception at a national level and making us feel slightly more empowered as a profession.
Well, the spontaneity and the genuineness of that outpouring actually, I think, was very affecting as well. And I know I can speak as a parent for a moment, you know, sitting here for the proportion of the last year I have with two primary school kids, you know, my appreciation of educators has gone through the roof, you know, because I do my lesson planning on a Sunday night and whatever, you know, and it is kind of funny on the one hand to be engaged in a pandemic and what you're doing, but actually you really appreciate, you know, how little I know about how to really teach a child, and I've got better, but boy, at the beginning it turns out that if you just tell them something really that you find very interesting, that doesn't really work. I mean, who knew that just talking at them wasn't going to be effective? So, you know, that might sound quite silly, but you really get a sense of how skillful our education workforce is, that they can bring a group of children in, they can make them feel comfortable and safe and get them ready to learn. It's an extraordinary set of skills that go into something that seems very simple. And I think this is a moment for us to really capture and build on that. I'm going to ask you all just for a last thought from you of, you know, coming back to the appreciation of staff in schools, you know, and I guess we'd love to see maybe after this piece of this discussion, perhaps we'll see an upsurge in appreciation across the country. But my question to you is, what would you like to see in place in schools to really embed appreciation as a practice in our schools?
For me, what I'd really like to see in place is schools really thinking about the kind of cultures and conditions that create a space where people feel safe to talk. Because actually, if people can talk, people can start to talk about the things that they appreciate, the things that they don't appreciate, and that dialogue begins. And I have seen some of the best work happen in organisations when it comes from the groundswell of people that are passionate, that are brave, because you've got to be quite brave to sort of raise your voice around this issue. But some of the best stuff happens when that happens. So if we can create the cultures where people feel safe enough to do that, I think we can really get appreciation on the agenda.
What would I think really help is a sort of 360-degree value culture. You know, so it's all like, you know, so individuals within the profession learning to see and appreciate what's out there and creating culture where that value is also comes within, you know, whether that's through advertising or lobbying or whatever it is, so that people properly understand. But it needs to be a 360-degree culture of value for me.
I think schools looking at the time and the space that they're making for staff professional development as we go back into schools. I think particularly for our newly qualified teachers and ITT who have not had a great deal of time working as part of a team and working in isolation, as well as more experienced teachers who have been having to teach in a completely different format. I think it's really important that we make the space and time to go back to the main thing, the core purpose of teaching, and enabling those conversations between teams to take place is going to be, I think, a really welcome distraction after a period of time of not being in a position to have those conversations at a collaborative level.
That's such a powerful point, Kat. And there's great evidence in the literature that good quality CPD that allows people to look up and look out. So not having an inset day on how to administer lateral flow tests, for example, but, you know, really good stuff that builds and speaks to their core purpose is directly correlated to their resilience. And of course, that's we're all going to need to be drawing on our resilience reserves over the next 12, 24 and 36 months. That seems like a very good place to end. I want to thank Ben and Kat and Faye for your time and your thoughtfulness on this conversation. And I also, since we're on the topic of appreciation, just to say to everyone out there who has kept the lights on in education, to every one of you who has reached out to a child or a young person and made them feel recognized and let them feel like they're still part of a community, even if they don't always, it's not always immediate for them. For the courage, the compassion and the grit that you all have demonstrated in this year of tremendous uncertainty. I thank you. I can only do that on my own behalf, but I do with a very full heart. And also to remind anyone out there that our helpline on 08000 562 561 is available 24/7. And you don't have to be in crisis to call it. You might just want to have a conversation with somebody. You might just not be feeling the best. And that's totally a perfect reason to use the helpline. So please do. Thank you very much.